I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the doorway of my own living room, holding a bottle of scotch I'd brought up from the basement, watching my son-in-law's hand resting on my wife's knee. It wasn't the hand that broke me. It was the way she laughed. She had a particular laugh she only used for me. That's what I'd always believed anyway. 63 years old and I still believed in things like that. A private laugh. A laugh that meant you're the only one who makes me feel this way. And there it was, coming out of her, in our living room, with the Christmas lights still up, because we hadn't gotten around to taking them down. And a man half my age leaning toward her, like he belonged there. I stepped back into the hallway before either of them saw me. I set the bottle of scotch down on the floor very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anyone to know. My daughter was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving around, opening and closing the fridge, probably making that cranberry sauce she always brought when they visited. She was humming something. She sounded happy. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a long time. Let me back up. My wife and I had been married for 38 years. We met when I was working at a hardware store in Barrie, and she came in asking for the right kind of caulking for a bathroom renovation she was doing herself, because, as she told me, she didn't trust anyone else to do it properly. I thought that was the most impressive thing I'd ever heard a woman say. I helped her find what she needed. I carried it to her car. I asked if I could take her to dinner. She said she'd think about it. She called 3 days later. We built a good life. Nothing spectacular. I worked in municipal planning for 30 years. She taught elementary school until she retired at 58. We had our daughter Becca, and we raised her in a house on a quiet street in Guelph, with a backyard big enough for a vegetable garden and a shed I never quite finished insulating properly. Becca grew up, moved to Toronto, married a man named Troy. We liked Troy. Or I thought we liked Troy. He was a personal trainer, fit and sociable, always had something to say. He called me by my first name from the very beginning, which I had mixed feelings about, but my wife said I was old-fashioned, and I suppose she was right. Troy and Becca had been married 4 years. They came up from Toronto every few months, sometimes just Sunday dinners, sometimes a long weekend. We had a good relationship. I thought we had a good relationship. That January visit was supposed to be routine. A post-Christmas catch-up, my wife's words. They arrived on Saturday afternoon, Troy with a 6-pack of something Kraft, Becca with that cranberry sauce, and a bag of gifts she'd held back from Christmas because she said she'd ordered them late and they hadn't arrived in time. We had dinner, we watched a movie, I went to bed around 10 because my back had been giving me trouble and sleeping in my own bed was the only reliable remedy. My wife stayed up with them. She often did. She was always the one who could go until midnight without flagging. I never minded. That was just who she was. But sometime around 11:30 I woke up and she still wasn't there beside me. And I lay in the dark for a few minutes, and then I decided to go downstairs and say goodnight properly and maybe bring up the scotch I'd been saving since fall. That's how I ended up in the hallway. That's how I ended up standing there in my socked feet, not breathing, watching my son-in-law's hand on my wife's knee, and hearing her laugh in a way that was supposed to belong only to me. I went back upstairs. I don't know how else to explain what I did next. I went back upstairs, I got into bed, and I lay there on my back with my eyes open until I heard the guest room door close, and then, a few minutes later, the sound of my wife on the stairs. She came in quietly. She always did when she thought I was sleeping. She changed in the dark and got in beside me, and I didn't move. "You awake?" she whispered. "No," I said. She made a small sound, maybe a laugh, maybe just a breath. She settled in. She was asleep in minutes. She always could do that, fall asleep like dropping off a ledge, instant and complete. I stared at the ceiling until it started to get light. Now I want to be careful here, because I'm 63 years old and I've lived long enough to know that a hand on a knee and a particular laugh are not proof of anything. I know that. I told myself that repeatedly in the dark that night. I told myself I was a tired man who had woken up disoriented and read something terrible into something ordinary. Becca was right there in the house. The three of them had been watching television together all evening. It was nothing. But I also knew my wife. I'd known her for 38 years, and there was something in the set of her shoulders when Troy was in the room that I had noticed before and chosen not to examine too closely. The way she deferred to his opinions at dinner, the way she remembered details he'd mentioned weeks earlier. Small things. The kind of small things you notice and file away because you're not ready to look at them directly. I was looking at them now. I didn't say anything the next morning. Becca made pancakes and Troy did the dishes without being asked, and my wife sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and the Sunday paper, and everything was completely normal. I watched her. I watched him. I watched the space between them. They left after lunch. I carried their bags to the car. I hugged Becca. I shook Troy's hand and looked him in the eye, and he looked right back at me, steady and easy, the way people do when they have nothing to hide, or when they've gotten very good at hiding things. I stood in the driveway and watched them pull away, and then I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table without taking my coat off. My wife came in from saying goodbye at the front window. She saw me sitting there and said, "You're still in your coat." "I know," I said. She made a face that meant you're being strange and started clearing up the lunch dishes. I sat there for another minute, and then I got up and went out to the shed. I didn't know what to do with what I was carrying. That's the honest truth. I'm not a man who talks easily about feelings. I grew up in a house where we didn't do that. And even 38 years with a woman who was much better at it than me hadn't fully undone that particular piece of my upbringing. I knew what I felt. I didn't know what to do with it. I stayed in the shed for 2 hours. The thing about suspicion is that once it's in, it rewrites everything that came before. I started going back through the last year, the last 2 years, pulling out moments and examining them in the new light of what I thought I'd seen. Troy texting during a dinner and my wife glancing at her own phone a moment later. A weekend in February when Becca came up alone because Troy had a work thing, and my wife had been quieter than usual, and I'd assumed it was just the winter. A comment Becca had made in passing about Troy traveling more for work lately, a kind of careful flatness in her voice when she said it. I didn't want to be wrong. I also didn't want to be right. Both of those things were true at the same time. I called my friend Ted about a week after that weekend. Ted was retired, lived about 20 minutes outside of town, and he was the kind of man I trusted because he didn't make things into more than they were, and he didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. I told him what I'd seen. I told him what I'd been thinking. There was a long pause. "Have you asked her?" he said. "No." "Why not?" I thought about it, because I'm not sure I want to know the answer yet. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then what are you going to do?" I said I didn't know. He said to call him when I figured it out. It was Becca who gave me the answer without meaning to. She called me about 10 days after their visit. She called my cell, not the house line, which was unusual. When I answered, she said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" The way she said it told me everything before she said another word. "Of course," I said. I walked out of the kitchen and stood in the front hallway, which was a habit I'd developed for phone calls I didn't want overheard. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you and Mom okay?" "Why do you ask?" "I don't know, She stopped, started again. Something feels off between her and Troy. I've been trying to figure out what it is, but I can't get a straight answer from either of them. And I thought maybe you'd noticed something." My daughter was asking me if my wife was having an affair with her husband. She didn't say those words, but that's what she was asking. I sat down on the bench by the front door. I took a breath. "Becca," I said, "what have you noticed?" She told me. It took a while. She'd been holding on to it, clearly, because once she started, it came out in a rush. The unexplained absences, the guarded phone, the way they interacted now in a way that was either more careful or less easy than it used to be. She couldn't tell which. A hotel point notification on an account she and Troy shared that she couldn't account for. A weekend last fall when he'd said he was at a conference in Ottawa and she'd called the hotel and his name wasn't on the reservation. The Ottawa conference. I remembered that weekend. My wife had gone to visit a friend in Hamilton that same weekend, an old colleague from the school board. She'd been looking forward to it, she'd said, a girls' weekend. I didn't say any of that to Becca, not yet. "Okay," I said. "I hear you. Let me think about this." Dad, I'm not brushing you off. I promise. Give me a few days." She said okay. She sounded very young. She'd sounded that way when she was small and frightened, and I hadn't heard it in her voice in many years, and it sat in my chest like a weight. I went to our bank that week. We'd had a joint account for almost 4 decades and a separate account my wife managed for household expenses. I asked for statements. I sat in the car in the parking lot of the TD branch on Stone Road, and I went through them. There was a pattern. Cash withdrawals, irregular but recurring over the past 14 months. Not enormous amounts, 100 here, 250 there, enough to add up to something, enough to be deliberate. There was also a hotel charge in Ottawa. October, the weekend of the conference. I sat in that car for a long time. Then I drove home. I didn't cry. I want to say that because people will wonder. I didn't cry that day or the days after. What I felt was something quieter than grief and harder to move through, a kind of flattening. Like all the rooms in my life had dropped their ceilings by 2 feet and I was navigating around my own furniture. I called Becca back. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. I told her that I thought she was right to trust what she'd been sensing and that she deserved to get to the bottom of it and that I was with her. She cried. I stayed on the phone with her for a long time. We made a decision together, my daughter and I, in that phone call. We weren't going to confront them separately. We weren't going to go in half prepared and get lied to and come out the other side with nothing resolved. We were going to do this together with everything laid out in a moment of our choosing. Becca said, "There's a long weekend in March. I was already going to suggest coming up." "All right," I said. March. I lived with my wife for 6 more weeks knowing what I knew. I want to be honest about what that was like. It was not noble. Some days I looked at her across the dinner table and felt nothing at all. Some days I felt a rage so complete that I had to go out to the shed and split wood for an hour. Some evenings she'd say something funny and I'd laugh and then hate myself for laughing. Some nights she'd put her hand on my arm and I'd let her. And in those moments I understood something I'd never understood before, about how people stay in things they shouldn't. How ordinary affection can coexist with betrayal, and how that coexistence is its own kind of slow damage. I didn't sleep well. I lost some weight without trying. Ted asked me once if I was okay, and I said I was fine. I was not fine. But I was careful. I didn't give anything away. I responded to Troy's texts about hockey scores with the same tone I always used. When Becca called, I talked to her the way a father talks to his daughter. And on the calls when she was clearly struggling, I was steady for her, because that was what she needed me to be. I prepared. I gathered the bank statements. I took photos of them. I wrote down the Ottawa dates on a piece of paper and put it in an envelope in the locked drawer of my desk in the shed. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't need to. The evidence I had wasn't nothing, and more importantly, we already knew. Both of us, Becca and I. We knew in the way you know things you can't prove, but can't unknow. That was enough. They arrived on the Friday evening of the long weekend in March. Becca came in first, and I hugged her in the doorway longer than usual, and she pressed her face against my shoulder for a moment like she needed to. Troy was behind her carrying bags, and he came in with that easy manner of his, and he said, "Good to see you, Gordon." And I said, "Good to see you too," and I did not say anything else. My wife had made a roast. She'd been cooking since 2 in the afternoon, the whole house warm with it. She was in good spirits, happy to have them there. That was hard to watch. I don't know what it says about me that the hardest part of all of it was seeing her happy. We got through dinner. The conversation was easy. Sports, weather, Becca and Troy's neighborhood in Toronto, some renovation they've been thinking about. I ate and I listened, and I looked at my wife's face when she wasn't looking at me, trying to find something there that would help me understand. I didn't find it. People are not transparent. That's something you don't fully learn until something like this. After dinner, Becca said she'd help clean up, and I said I'd get the kettle on. And for a few minutes, the 4 of us were moving around the kitchen with the particular ease of a family that's been in the same kitchen together many times. And then in a lull, when Troy was in the hallway getting something from his bag and my wife was at the sink, Becca looked at me and I gave her a small nod. She took a breath. "Mom," she said, "I need to talk to both of you about something." My wife turned from the sink. Her expression shifted into the look parents get when they think something serious is coming, medical or financial or trouble. "What is it?" she said. Troy came back into the kitchen. "Sit down," I said. It came out very quietly. But something in my voice must have changed, because my wife looked at me differently then. Not at Becca. At me. We sat around the kitchen table, the 4 of us, the roast pan still on the counter, the overhead light a little too bright. Becca laid it out. She was composed and she was clear, and she did not raise her voice. She had organized her thoughts, and she delivered them with a precision that made me proud of her in a way that went somewhere beneath words. She talked about what she'd noticed, what she'd confirmed, the hotel points, the Ottawa reservation. Troy started to speak twice. Both times Becca said, "I'm not finished." I took the bank statements out of the folder I'd set on the table, and I put them in front of my wife without a word. She looked at them. Nobody said anything. Then Troy said, "This isn't," and my wife said, "Stop." There was a silence that seemed to last longer than it was. My wife looked up from the statements. She looked at me. Her face had changed entirely. The happiness of the evening was gone, and what was there instead was something older and harder to read. Not guilt, not quite. Something more like exhaustion. Like she had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just put it down, and the relief and the shame of the relief were both present at once. "How long have you known?" she said. "A while," I said. Troy said something. I don't remember what it was. I don't think it mattered. Becca looked at her husband. She said, "I want you to go to the guest room tonight. I'll drive you to the GO station in the morning." Troy said her name. She said, "Please don't." He got up and left the kitchen. My wife and I sat at that table for a long time after Becca went upstairs. She told me it had started the previous spring. She said she hadn't planned it, which I believed and which didn't help. She said she didn't know how to explain it, and I said I wasn't asking her to explain it. I was asking her whether it was over. And she said yes. She said it had ended in November. She said she'd been living with it since November, and it had been the worst months of her life. I said, "You understand that's not something you can tell me." She said she understood. I said, "I need you to find somewhere else to stay for a while." She didn't argue. She sat very still for a moment, and then she nodded. She went to her sister's in Kitchener the next morning. She took a bag in her car, and she left while the light was still thin and gray, and I stood at the window and watched her pull out of the driveway. And I thought about 38 years, and how a house that has held a marriage for 38 years sounds different when half of it has walked out the door. Different, not empty, but different. The weeks that followed were not simple. I won't pretend there were clean answers. My wife and I talked, on the phone at first, and then in person, carefully, the way you handle something that might break further if you hold it wrong. Our daughter was going to the end of her marriage in Toronto, and I tried to be present for that, without making everything about me, which was not always something I managed. I saw a lawyer. Not immediately, but I did. A woman in town who'd handled a colleague's divorce some years before, and who I trusted to be straight with me. She went through the financials. She explained what our options were under Ontario family law. She made sure I understood what I was entitled to and what the process looked like. That was important. Not because I was certain about what I wanted to do, but because I needed to understand the ground beneath my feet before I could decide anything. My wife asked in early April if there was any possibility of working through it. She said she wanted to try. I told her I needed more time to know. I started seeing a counselor, a man about my age who'd been recommended by my family doctor. I went every 2 weeks. I talked more than I had talked in years. Some of it was about my wife. Some of it was about other things, older things. Things I'd put in the same locked drawer I kept all the rest of it. That surprised me, how much else was in there. I am not going to tell you how the marriage ended, because I don't know yet. What I can tell you is that I'm still in the house on that quiet street in Guelph. The vegetable garden is going in late this year because my back was worse than usual in April, but the shed is still standing and I finally got around to insulating it properly. I do that now. I finish things. My daughter is doing better than I expected. She is a strong person, and she comes from strong people, and she has friends who showed up for her in a way that reminded me there is still a lot of good in how people treat each other. She calls me every few days. Sometimes we don't talk about any of it. We talk about ordinary things, what she's cooking, what I've been watching, whether the Leafs are going to break our hearts again this year, which they will. They always do. You learn to love them anyway. I turned 64 in May. Ted took me out for dinner at a steakhouse on the edge of town, and we sat there for 3 hours, and he let me talk, and he ate his steak, and he didn't try to fix anything, which was what I needed. There are nights when I lie in that bed, and the other half of it feels very large. 38 years is most of an adult life. You don't grieve that quickly or cleanly or all at once. You grieve it in the middle of ordinary things, at the hardware store, cutting the grass, watching the news. It ambushes you, and then you go on. I don't know what I believe about love after a thing like this. I know what I used to believe. I had a laugh that I thought belonged only to me. Maybe that was never true. Maybe it was true, and then it wasn't. I don't know which of those is harder to carry. What I know is this. I got up every morning, I kept the house going, I showed up for my daughter, I told the truth when it counted, and I held my ground when I needed to. and I didn't disappear. That's all I've got right now. Some days that's enough. I keep thinking about the hallway, not the kitchen table, not the bank statements, not even the morning my wife drove away with a single bag. The hallway. Me standing there in my socked feet, holding a bottle of scotch I never opened, deciding in about 4 seconds whether to walk in or step back. I stepped back, and I think that one decision, quiet, unglamorous, made in a dark hallway at 11:30 at night, was the only reason any of what came after was handled with any dignity at all. There's something I've come to understand about the way things play out when trust is broken. It isn't random. The people who cause that kind of damage don't arrive suddenly. They're allowed in gradually, over time, through small permissions we grant without noticing. A boundary not held here, a discomfort swallowed there, a pattern we see but choose not to name. I'm not saying what happened was my fault. It wasn't. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed things over the years and filed them away because looking directly at them felt like too much. That filing away has a cost. I know that now. What Becca did took something I didn't fully have at her age. She sat at that table and she told the truth about what she'd seen, clearly and without cruelty, even though the truth was going to cost her her marriage. She didn't perform anger. She didn't lose herself in it. She had worked out what she knew, what she could prove, and what she needed to say, and she said it. That's a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with schooling. It's the intelligence of a person who has thought carefully about hard things and decided that honesty, even painful honesty, is the only ground worth standing on. I'm proud of her for that. I told her so. I don't say things like that easily, and I made sure I said it. As for me, the months after were the hardest stretch I've had since my father died. There were mornings I didn't want to get out of bed, not because I was giving up, just because grief is genuinely heavy, and some days it sits on your chest and you have to get up anyway. I got up anyway. I kept the house. I showed up for my daughter when she needed me to. I went to that counselor every 2 weeks and said things out loud that had been sitting in a locked drawer for longer than this marriage. That part surprised me the most. How much was already in there before any of this happened. How much I'd been carrying without calling it carrying. I don't know what I'd tell a younger man going through something like this. Maybe just don't disappear into it. Feel it, but don't let it make you smaller. Hold your ground, not because you're certain of the outcome, but because holding your ground is what lets you look at yourself in the mirror when it's over. 38 years is not nothing. I won't pretend it is, but neither is 64 years of being a person who, when everything came apart, chose to be honest instead of bitter, careful instead of reckless, and present instead of gone. That's what I've got. Some days it's enough. Most days it actually is.